Welcome to the Heritage is Living podcast, a place to explore and challenge what heritage is and how it fits into our world today. Through this podcast, we'll speak with experts in the heritage field and beyond to understand how heritage can help us to live aware, with care, and with purpose. This podcast is recorded in Ottawa on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Trust works on the lands and territories of many Indigenous peoples across what is now known as Canada. I'm your host, Patricia Kell, Executive Director of the National Trust for Canada. On this episode, we are discussing the connection between heritage conservation and climate action with Lloyd Alter. Lloyd Alter has been an architect, real estate developer, and writer, and is a past president of the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario. He teaches sustainable design at Toronto Metropolitan University. He has contributed to many publications, including The Guardian, Green Building Advisor, Corporate Knights and Azure Magazines, and was a contributor and editor at treehugger.com for 15 years. Lloyd is the author of Living the 1.5 Degree Lifestyle from New Society Publishers. His new book, The Story of Upfront Carbon, will be published in May 2024. Thank you for joining me today. So let's begin by talking a little bit about you. How did you get involved with heritage?
Well, back in the 1980s, I was an architect, and I happened, like many architects do, started with renovations and ended up with a very big, very important renovation right at the corner of Queen and Yonge Street in Toronto, the Jameson Building, and which has just been completely renovated again by ERA. There's a thing in England called the Rubble Club that if you survive your buildings, if a building is knocked down, you get to join this club. And if there was a Rubble Club in Ontario, I would be the charter member. Everything's gone, but there we are. There we are. So anyhow, I got interested in it then. I won some awards from the Toronto Historical Board for the work that I did. And then Catherine Naismith, who has been on the board of your organization for a number of years, got me involved with the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario. And I eventually became president of the ACO and was deeply involved with publicity, with getting the word out. And so I started a newsletter that I put out every week, a quite long newsletter with something to do with it. And I just got more and more interested every day. And then in 2008, there was a big conference in Collingwood where Donovan Ripkema, a famous, well-known consultant in the States, came up and started talking about embodied energy in buildings. And that was the first I'd heard of embodied energy. And it went from there. I developed a thesis, a line that I still use all the time, that I used at the time, that our heritage buildings are not relics from the past, but they're templates for the future. Because basically you could look at them and see, why do these buildings last? Why are they good? They were designed before the thermostat age. They have big thermal mass so that they could stay warm throughout the day and night. They were frugal in their use of heating because somebody had to carry all the coal. They were flexible in their plan and they were lovable. You know, people liked these buildings. And these are all words from the original Green by Steve Mouzon, an American heritage consultant who basically I thought he was absolutely right. And so that's how I got involved and stayed involved out of the thinking about this original Green.
Thank you. So let's move on and talk a little bit about your work on climate then. So how do you see the connection between heritage conservation and climate action?
Well, this is all due to when Donovan Ripkema and Kathy Naismith were talking about embodied energy, people really didn't understand it. And some, including a well-known heritage consultant who I won't name, said, this is just stupid. It's water under the bridge. Who cares about the energy that it took to make bricks 100 years ago? And this selling the idea of embodied energy as a reason to save buildings was a hard sell. But what's happened since...
Sorry, I'm just thinking maybe we should just do a sidebar here and talk about what embodied energy is.
Well, embodied energy at the time we were talking, it was the energy that went into making things like bricks, making things like windows. And when we were then worried about energy, which was the preoccupation ever since the oil crisis of the 50s, people said, we should be worried about it. And the concept, because as this heritage expert said, it was water under the bridge, made it a hard sell. It was also a hard sell to sell anybody about heritage buildings at the time because they used a lot of energy. They didn't have much insulation. They had single glazing. They basically, to make them really use less energy was very, very expensive. And so it was very hard to convince anyone from an energy point of view that old buildings were better than new buildings, even though there were studies that showed that buildings that were built before 1920, say, were far better in terms of energy performance than buildings built in 1950, when the modern movement came in and everybody said, oh, energy's cheap and we love floor-to-ceiling glass and everything. But it was still always a hard sell. What changed was Kyoto and the recognition that the problem that we face is carbon. It's not energy. It's how much carbon is released. And in 2015, by the Paris Accord, the science was pretty certain that we know how much carbon we can put into the atmosphere and how much temperature rise it's going to cause. And so then we started looking at what you do to reduce the amount of carbon. And so the language changed from embodied energy to being worried about embodied carbon.
So can we just pause there for a moment? Because I'm wanting to be sure that everybody, including myself, fully understands the difference between carbon and energy. So when we burn fossil fuels, we release carbon.
Exactly.
But you're saying there's an important difference between the two. So can you just explain that a little bit?
Well, electricity, for instance, is energy, and it's useful energy that does our lighting and does our air conditioning. And in much of Canada and Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia and Manitoba, we get our electricity from water and nuclear. And so it's energy, but it's very low carbon. It's burning fossil fuels that produces carbon dioxide, burning coal and burning natural gas. So the fundamental shift when you talk about carbon instead of energy is that we do have options that are low carbon, and the options get better and better every year with the development of better solar cells and wind turbines and batteries. None of these things existed 20 years ago when we're talking about energy. So the difference, this is the critical difference when you're worried about carbon, that we can get zero carbon electricity if we want it, zero carbon energy. So here we have still this fundamental confusion that, our building codes and everybody, we've had energy on the brain for 50 years, since 1974. And getting people to make the mind switch to carbon is hard, but this is what we have to do.
So just to come back and make sure that I've got that right. So initially, when we talked about the climate crisis, we talked about the need to reduce energy consumption, or energy consumption as a sort of a way of expressing what the problem was. But in fact, that is not. It is, when we are only talking about burning fossil fuels, it is a good estimate of the problem. But when we're talking other things and have options other than fossil fuels, then it ceases to be the critical piece. And what becomes critical is the carbon balance, the use of carbon, the consumption of carbon, and the release of carbon into the atmosphere.
Exactly. Now, once you wrap your brain around that, the next step is the fact that we have to start thinking about, well, we said embodied carbon was what we have to worry about, but Embodied carbon is a really confusing and stupid term because embodied by definition means that it's in it, it's embodied. And when we were talking energy, you could say, well, the energy to make it went into it. But with carbon, no, it's in the air, it's in the atmosphere, it's not embodied. And this is why I developed with two others, architects, back in 2018, the term upfront carbon. That let's not call it embodied anymore because it isn't. Let's call it upfront carbon, which is the carbon it takes to make something, which is the equivalent of embodied, and then operating carbon, the carbon that comes from burning fossil fuels to keep a building warm and to keep a car moving. So you've got these two kinds of carbon. Now, one of the reasons that nobody worried much about embodied energy was because the energy from making things was usually coal that was making electricity, or that was making steel, or that was making heating limestone to make concrete. And we may have had an energy crisis, but we never had a coal crisis. We always had coal coming out of our ears. So nobody much worried about it because, okay, we'll make this new stuff. We'll use burning coal to melt rock to make insulation, which means that we'll use less operating energy. But there was never much concern about what it took to make things. And once we realized our problem is carbon, this concept of the upfront carbon that it takes to make things becomes really critical. Because now, when you go full circle back to our existing buildings, if you build a new building, it's made of concrete and it's made of steel and it's made of glass, all of which are now made with coal, all of which puts out a huge amount of upfront carbon emissions. You take up your existing building, it's all there. You might upgrade the building a little bit, but you're not having any of those upfront emissions from making the materials. So if someone comes to me and says, well, I'm going to knock this building down because it's kind of leaky, and we're going to build you a LEED platinum, gorgeous brand new building, it won't have very many operating emissions at all. And I'll say, okay, how much concrete went into it? How much steel? How big are the foundations? How much underground parking is there? All of these questions that are the critical question today. Every kilogram of carbon that goes into the atmosphere now goes up against that ceiling, that budget that was set out that we have can only add so much carbon to the atmosphere. So every time we knock down a building and replace it, we're creating more carbon. Whereas if we take our old building and we fix it a little bit and reduce the operating emissions, we're way ahead. We're 50 years, 100 years ahead in carbon than we are replacing it. And that's the fundamental switch, the fundamental transformation that happened over the last 10 years where, embodied energy was water under the bridge. It was gone. It wasn't, it was really meaningless. To embodied carbon is seriously important. And that's where we are today. You no longer have to fight to save old buildings in the UK, for example, where they're way ahead of this. You don't fight to save old buildings. The developers have to come in and say, why can't we save this building? Tell us why you have to replace this building. Let's see a whole analysis over the next 20 years whether replacing this building will actually reduce the carbon emissions compared to fixing the existing building. And it's become a huge controversial exercise that they go through on every single building now.
So I think there are a couple of sort of important points that you're making that I'd like to come back on. So one
Absolutely.
is,
I'm sorry, I talked too fast on this.
It's fantastic. It's fantastic. And it's so interesting and so important. So on the balance of carbon, so, I mean, you described in a general way how the upfront carbon and the operational carbon sort of go together. You need to look at them together to get a whole picture of what the carbon budget for this building is over a 50 or 100-year period.
Right.
Are there actually tools that allow you to calculate that?
Absolutely. There are tools that you can pump in easily, existing building, new building, carbon this, carbon that. There are consultant firms that have been set up to do it. In Because in the UK, you have to do the study for every building permit that you do. It's a very well-developed consultancies, and there are consultancies in Ontario, and I mean in Canada, that are doing it now too. So the tools are there. I have played with, there are some tools that are so simple to use that you can basically anyone can just go online, download them for free, and say, I'm going to build my house out of this, I'm going to build my house out of that, I'm going to tear it down, I'm going to replace it, and you can find it out very quickly.
Excellent, thank you. So it's not just a sort of theoretical construct or a nice idea. It is a demonstrable reality. We can show with numbers that is in fact the case. And then I wanted to come back on this requirement that now exists in at least some places in England, that you must do this analysis before you tear down an existing building and replace it. I'm aware that in Canada, there is a requirement to look at upfront carbon, but only for new construction. And so do you see any progress or traction in terms of having a more robust look at the carbon budget in terms of existing buildings in the Canadian context?
Well, we have to work harder to get the kind of legislation here that happened in the UK. And it happened in the UK under conservative governments, remember. It's not a radical lefty thing. It's people who are seriously looking at, we've got carbon problem. What is the best way to solve the carbon problem that we have? And the issue is to reduce our carbon emissions at all possible. And you mentioned also the 50 to 100 years, that this is another danger that we fall into, what's called the life cycle trap, I call it, where people will come along and say, well, we'll build this new building out of concrete and glass, but if you look at it over 50 years, it's not that bad. But the thing is that, there are now emissions and there are later emissions, which is another way of saying the upfront emissions. When we were trying to say, what do we call them? Upfront carbon, and the other guy said, we'll call it vomited carbon or burped carbon or spiked carbon. Words that will get it across the sort of the nowness, the urgency of the situation. And we decided to be more civil and go with upfront. But we wanted to make the point that clearly that now emissions really are different. And so that's the problem with the 50-year life cycle thing, because what we're worried about is staying under the ceilings of carbon now. And it's so strong in Britain that Oliver Moore, Rowan Moore, the writer for The Guardian, put forward the proposition that we should never demolish another building, period. That basically every time we demolish a building, we're creating this burp of carbon with the new construction. And so it should just be policy. We fix everything that we can. We add on to everything that we can if we need more space, which is what they do in Germany and Sweden. You say, no, that's a nice building. You can't knock it down, but you can put 3 floors on it. It's very common.
Right. And so, I find it sort of paradoxical that in many aspects of our life, we have really adopted a reduce, reuse, recycle kind of mentality, but that for buildings, we don't seem to start from that as our beginning premise.
No, and there's always some kind of reasons. The main reason used to be, it's not energy efficient and it costs too much to operate. And we now know, we know what to do to reduce that. And again, you've got to now, which you never used to do, have to balance that extra operating cost against the upfront carbon cost, because carbon is carbon is carbon. And we have to measure it all, which we never used to do.
Right. So one of the things that you've spoken about is the use of heat pumps and their benefit in heritage. So presumably this is a way to reduce the ongoing operating costs in a heritage building. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Heat pumps are a wonderful revolution in our thinking about what we do with buildings. If you recall, our biggest problem was always that we heated our buildings with natural gas, oil in some places, and maybe even somewhere still coal. And this had a huge carbon footprint, obviously, and we couldn't use electricity because it was basically resistance, like baseboard heaters, really expensive, like 3 times the cost of gas. So this was a serious problem. Now, again, remembering always that fundamentally the problem we're dealing with from a climate point of view is carbon emissions. So what happened when heat pumps came along? Heat pumps have been around for 100 years. Every refrigerator is a heat pump. Every air conditioner is a heat pump. They're moving one heat from one place to another. What happens when you turn an air conditioner backwards is that it's taking heat out of the air and bringing it inside. And in the last 10 years, they got the technology improved where they could take the heat out of really cold Canadian air. People would say, oh, there's no heat out there. It's below zero. I say, it's also 273 degrees Kelvin. That's how much heat's there, I've always thought, I've been joking a lot lately. I said, oh, it's a balmy 269 degrees out today, to just make the point that even when it's 5 below 0 Celsius, there's a lot of heat energy running around out there. And so heat pumps pull it out of the air, and they do it. The energy consumed is like running the pump, not generating the heat. And so you get 4 times as much energy out of it as you put into it. And what this means is that you can hook up a heat pump to a clean electrical source like Niagara Falls or Pickering Power Plant, and you are generating heat for your building with 0 carbon emissions. So where it used to be the only way to reduce operating carbon emissions was to say, insulate, and, change all the windows in this building and gut the whole thing and spend $1 zillion on your heritage building and lose possibly a lot of heritage features along the way, like beautiful windows and things like that. Now we can say, we can do what I call a light renovation. We insulate the attics and the basements, and we caulk, because everybody forgets that 40% of heat loss in a building is through air leakage, not through the walls, through insulation. Heritage buildings have nice thick walls, and they basically are very good at this. They don't leak a lot if you fix the building properly. So you do the easy stuff. The wonderful Harold Orr, the consultant in Saskatchewan, said you do the big chunks first. So we do the big chunks, and then we make up the difference with a heat pump, and voila, you've got a building emitting no carbon. And because it's an existing building, didn't take any upfront carbon to build the thing.
Right. So if we go through your equation, the upfront carbon already there, minimal investment to improve the thermal performance of the building that's there, a heat pump which runs on a clean energy source, and to reduce the ongoing carbon, and voila, a wonderful building with character and low carbon footprint, high energy performance.
Well, someone may still say, well, I'm spending still a lot on operating, I've got to run this heat pump. And you say, yes, but you didn't have to pay to build the whole damn building. Look what you paid for. And you didn't have to do it's, I'm also very much involved in the energy saving community, and are very much on, no, this isn't enough. You still have to reduce electrical demand as much as possible because there aren't enough clean electrons to go around. And I say, yes, we do. But there are a lot of buildings that are really important, heritage buildings, where we don't want to lose a lot of the things. And we can still make them good, low carbon buildings with the technology we have today.
That's so encouraging. So I'd like to turn now and talk a little bit about what needs to change to make climate considerations more central to decision making about heritage buildings. So given that the embodied carbon is the principal argument for maintaining heritage buildings and existing buildings in this context, who do you think we need to convince of the importance of embodied carbon to maximize the consideration for conserving existing buildings?
Well, I mean, the main people who have to deal with this are the regulators. We have to convince the regulators that if you're serious about carbon emissions, then you've got to stop just having an energy focus on insulation and R values and things like that. And you've got to start understanding and regulating the upfront carbon as well, and minimizing this as much as possible. And that may well be on new buildings with choices of materials. So, for instance, that's why there's this whole mass timber movement going that's been happening. But it's going to also, the regulators are going to have to start getting serious about not allowing demolition unless it's proven that we're going to be better off with it. To do that, we also have to educate the public that simply does not understand this subject at all. And I think in a lot of ways, because the phrase embodied carbon was such a bad one, I'm actually, where I know this is just a podcast, but I've just developed a new book, The Story of Upfront Carbon, which is entirely designed to explain to the public that, hey, you can buy an electric car, but it took 20 tons of carbon emissions to make that car, or you could buy an electric bike that took 500 kilograms, and guess which is going to be better ahead? You could be better off to get a smaller apartment. I'm actually speaking next Thursday at a conference in Paris about the subject of sufficiency, about how much do we really need of everything. And this is another thing that comes back to preservation of existing and heritage buildings, because we have to start asking, do we need a new office building here? Do we need this? The office market has kind of crashed. Maybe we shouldn't be building these anymore and we should be fixing what we have. Maybe if I'm going to live in this house, we might take this big old beautiful house and convert it into 3 flats. This is happening more and more, and save the existing building. I mean, my own house here that I'm talking to you from is a 1913 developer house in sort of a streetcar suburb of Toronto. And I wanted to sell it. And my wife said, I like this house. And I said, we don't need 3 stories in that. And so we subdivided it. We cut it in half. I rent the upper 2 floors to my daughter's family. We have totally, completely separate lives. But what have we done? We've cut the operating carbon and, in fact, embodied carbon of each of us in half per capita, and by living in smaller spaces and figuring out what is sufficient. And I think that combination of understanding upfront carbon and understanding sufficiency, like, do we really need to replace this? No. Sufficiency is going to be sort of, I think, the next big thing. And the quote I like to use is from an Australian philosopher who said, without sufficiency, efficiency is lost, because, what's the point of doing it? And so that's where we're going.
That's a really powerful concept, and I think a very interesting sort of idea to feed into things like the discussion about intensification of housing in urban centers, where the primary solution seems to be to build up, right? So everyone still has their big space. It's just going up further in the air, as opposed to sort of thinking carefully about what it is we actually all need. So thank you for bringing that to the conversation. So a couple more questions around the idea of what needs to change. So do you think that the concept of designation, so this traditional tool that we've had for managing places that were historically important, has a relationship with climate justice?
Well, it does if it preserves buildings. And, every building preserved and not replaced with something else is preventing carbon emissions. But where designation fails is to pick up again Rowan Moore's point. Let's just ban demolition anywhere. Why not make it the default that like everything is essentially should be designated? And it's just not. We keep thinking just of our grade A historic heritage buildings, that John A. Macdonald slept here or whatever, or that something happened that it's got a plaque, or that it was a great argument. But like every existing building can have a role. I mean, Jane Jacobs' wonderful line that new ideas need old buildings is still absolutely true. And so if there's one problem with designation is that in a low carbon world, it doesn't go nearly far enough.
And so some of the other tools that have been the standards in the heritage tool belt include things like giving grants or possibly tax incentives or benefits. Do you see those as figuring into a way forward in this area?
Well, yes. For instance, there have been in the past year, the program just ended, serious grants to provide heat pumps to get people off gas. There have been serious grants to allow for insulation, to provide for insulation. And the Canadian grants did a wonderful thing that they didn't do anywhere else in the world that really showed that they were thinking. And that is, again, people hadn't realized that how much energy leaks out through buildings. And so it was a requirement to get the grant that you do a blower door test, what I call that you fill in the door with this thing that a friend of mine nicknamed the great red door of truth, that it tells you how much air is being leaking out of your building. And just fixing that makes a huge difference. It can cut your heat loss by 40%. Just by going in, doing the red door of truth, figuring out where the house is leaking, and caulking the leaks. And that's dealing with older buildings, and it's dealing with existing buildings. And if it was done at every old building, which could be done for a couple of $100 per building and per house, and then they say, okay, we're coming in, you've got a grant to do caulking of your existing building, and the caulking goes first. And again, doing that light stuff, if we did that to all of our old buildings, we could cut our carbon emissions by 40% without spending zillions of dollars. And so
that's amazing.
That's what we should be doing first, the easy stuff. It doesn't happen because the whole construction industry is based on, you're getting a percentage of how much money is put in. So which is why the window salesmen are the most successful people in the whole industry. They come in, they ruin all our old houses to change the windows, promise 40% energy saving. They never give us 40% energy savings. They sometimes make it worse because they don't caulk it properly when they put it in. And they ignore the fact of that what was the Donovan Rickema's brilliant line about replacement windows, coming in and replacing windows. Why are they called replacement windows? Because every 20 years you have to replace them again. And the fact is, historic windows can be restored, and they have a better R value than double glazing. Often you can do what I did, because I have wonderful old windows, is I bought inserts that go in the inside, which weren't cheap, but are a whole lot cheaper than new windows and maintain the character of the house. But people come in and they, it's the window salesman and the insulation salesman who want the big dollar stuff, when what we need is a blower door, an infrared camera shot, and a gallon of caulk.
That's fantastic. That's the kind of solution that we all could be making progress on in our own lives, in our own homes.
Yes.
Doesn't require a huge change in anything. So maybe finally we could talk about why it's important to make the link between climate and heritage. And so what would be the consequence of making decisions about whether to keep or demolish existing buildings looking through a climate lens? If we did this consistently, how would the world be different?
Well, absolutely. If we did it consistently, we would look at every building and we would have the ledger. We would have to have a ledger and we would say on this ledger, okay, here's the existing building. What do we do to it to reduce its carbon emissions, and what would that cost, and what would be the impact in the short term? Because again, there's a time value of carbon. Who cares right now what it's doing 50 years down the road? I care about what goes into it now and the time value of carbon. Carbon now is far more important. So weighing the time value of carbon, we take our existing building, and I think we have to look at it for a better word than heritage, because as soon as we say heritage, we're separating it from the buildings that have some attribute that we call heritage from existing buildings. And I'm putting them in the same bucket. I think every older building is worthy of being looked at for saving. The heritage buildings have that extra little oomph that maybe makes it more, you know what I'm saying, but this is an issue that we have to face with every existing building. And so we have to have that ledger. What is the gain that we're going to get by knocking this down and replacing it with a new building from a carbon point of view within the framework of between now and 2030, or maybe if you want to push it to 2050 at the latest. And that is when the analysis is probably going to say every time, let's fix the existing building.
Excellent. So, final question. What can we learn from existing buildings about how to create excellent structures and excellent communities for the future? There's a quote of yours where you've said, "We are no longer trying to save the past, we are trying to save the future." So what can we learn from the past to help inform that?
Well, again, I would, in a lot of ways, go back to Steve Mouzon. And his four things about buildings, older buildings being flexible, how I have personally turned schools into condos, and older office buildings when everybody's looking at conversions now. Hey, it's the older office buildings that were shallower because they didn't have artificial light. And so they actually convert better to apartments than newer office buildings. And so the older buildings were flexible. In a lot of ways, his line about they were frugal because you had the thick walls and smaller windows, whereas you go floor to ceiling glass. I mean, they're energy hogs for sure, no matter what you do. But I think that the line that he used, that most of all, that troubled a lot of people, was lovable being an attribute. It wasn't beautiful. We actually argued, should it be beautiful or should it be lovable? And he convinced me it should be lovable, that people look at these things and they have a connection with them. And older buildings, so many older buildings connect to people in ways that we have no idea. One building of mine that was knocked down at Yonge and Eglinton in Toronto was a strip mall, a two-story strip mall at Yonge and Eglinton. That was a lot of people thought really ugly. I spent a lot of time making the most ingenious up and down stairs you could go. And ERA did a historic evaluation and said, "Oh, this building's a piece of junk. It's got no value whatsoever." I said, "Thanks, Michael. I appreciated that, you know." And then people started getting interviewed who used the building because it was like the only sort of the building like that in the area, and it had the cheap Korean restaurant, and it had the game store, and it had the tattoo parlor, and it had all the uses that people loved. And they said, Where are they going to go? And it's again Jane Jacobs all over again, that the building was actually loved. I was shocked. Yes, I was happy to see it gone. Yet, where are the tattoo parlors going to go? Where are the record stores going to go? If we just turn, the entire world cannot be a Shoppers Drug Mart and a TD Bank. We've got to keep these buildings of different characters and different ages and different rents and different legal covenants required, or everything's going to just turn into a monoculture of big boxes. And this is critical. This is another aspect that isn't looked at enough, about how do we maintain a character and culture of it. If you go down Yonge Street in Toronto, where there was a rule that, the front 20 feet of those buildings, 6 meters of those buildings have to be preserved and the condos go up behind them. But it's what, oh God, Kathy Naismith's husband, the landscape architect, his name just popped out of my head right now. I can't believe this. Anyhow, he called it urban taxidermy, that basically you're keeping these facades, but where there used to be a little clothing store, now 3 in a row will be one big Royal Bank branch. That the entire character of the street has been lost. And what we're left with by just keeping these 20 feet of the facade is a useless remnant. So
it's interesting because I think what you're saying at least alludes to a kind of a local economy, a micro economy that exists in the neighborhood around a building, and in a bit the same way that the carbon savings that we were talking about may be happening on quite a small scale in the individual's life, that the importance of these buildings also has a really human scale on the scale of the community.
Absolutely. And, the whole thesis, the biggest planning idea happening right now, the controversial Carlos Moreno's idea of the 15-minute city. And in a 15-minute city, you've got to not only be able to find a Shoppers Drug Mart and a Royal Bank, the big monocultures, you've also want to be able to find the coffee shop and the pastry shop and the baguette and all of the things that I have, because I live in a streetcar suburb designed in 1920 that still has a streetcar even, that I can walk up and get all these things. And this is the kind of saving old buildings isn't just about the buildings itself. It's about the culture. It's about the neighborhood. It's about the kinds of places that we want to actually live in. And we're losing them.
Lloyd, thank you so much for having this conversation with me today. I really appreciate you explaining the balance of carbon in older buildings, and this has been a really illuminating conversation. Thank you. Heritages Living is produced in English and in French and is available wherever you listen to your podcasts. Follow us on your favorite podcast platform to never miss an episode as we explore how heritage conservation is more than you think.